Coming up, this week saw the publication of the supplementary report by the Privileges Committee, which gave details of the coordinated campaign of interference in the committee's working, investigating the conduct of one Boris Johnson, if you remember him. I've read the full report so you don't have to. It sets out anti-democratic behaviour by leading UK Conservative politicians who appear to have borrowed the playbook of the very worst monsters amongst Trump's enablers in America. The supplementary report paints a disturbing attempt to subvert parliamentary democracy and names and shames those responsible, including former ministers Nadine Dorries and Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg. Stay tuned. I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button, subscribe, and above all, share a link to this video with your social media contacts. For any of you who've been hiding under a rock for the last few months, ex-Prime Minister Alexander Boris Johnson quit as an MP after the Privileges Committee found he misled Parliament on multiple occasions over COVID breaches at Number 10. During their investigation, members of the committee were subjected to a campaign of what they refer to as vociferous attacks from the dwindling and increasingly desperate band of Johnson allies. The integrity of the committee as a whole was also impugned, with repeated and multiple baseless accusations that it was a kangaroo court biased against Johnson and that its motivation was to seek revenge for Brexit, despite Tory and pro-Brexit MPs making up the majority of the committee. And the Brexiteers claim that it's us rejoiners that think everything is about Brexit. The supplementary report specifically names disgraced I'm a Celebrity Nadine Dorries, disgraced Grenfell commentator Jacob Rees-Mogg, the disgraced multiple ministerial code-breaking Priti Patel, the well-known racist ex-London mayoral candidate Zac Goldsmith, transphobic MP Mark Jenkinson, the ludicrous Johnson toady Michael Fabricant, opponent of taking the knee Brendan Clark-Smith of the Tory Common Sense Group and European Research Group, and ex-minister and ERG deputy chairwoman Andrea Jenkins, she of the finger. The report accused these figures of applying unprecedented and coordinated pressure on the committee, raising significant security concerns for members of the committee. The report said free speech was at the heart of parliamentary democracy, but some politicians had interfered with disciplinary proceedings set up by the Commons in an unacceptable way, suggesting that abuse of committee members could deter others from serving on the committee in the future. And this is where I think the line has to be drawn. Of course, anyone can criticise the findings of the committee, but just provide evidence that their findings are wrong. If you have proof that their conclusions are false, then show us that proof. But these prominent Tories, singled out by the committee, have no evidence whatsoever, so their only recourse is, to use footballing parlance, to play the man, not the ball. Or to use the parlance from my 20 years in human resources, it's a principle of natural justice that you can criticise performance, but not personality. Because these Johnson allies cannot criticise the findings of the committee, they go after the reputation of the committee itself, and that's where the line is crossed. The report found that Johnson's fan club had wanted to stop the inquiry, coming to a conclusion which the critics did not want, through a coordinated campaign of tweets and media appearances aimed at driving Conservative members off the committee entirely. In its original report, the committee had said, from the outset of this inquiry, there has been a sustained attempt, seemingly coordinated, to undermine the committee's credibility and, more worryingly, that of those members serving on it. The committee is concerned that if these behaviours go unchallenged, it will be impossible for the House to establish such a committee to conduct sensitive and important inquiries in the future. Here are some examples of the kind of statements that were made as part of this coordinated campaign to undermine parliamentary democracy. Let's start with some of the worst nonsense from Nadine Dorries. They have nothing. He protested his innocence all along, and he was right. It was a gross miscarriage of justice at the very least. So there you go. Because Boris Johnson protested his innocence all along, that proves the committee's report was a gross miscarriage of justice, at the very least, whatever that's meant to mean. She says the committee had nothing. which must mean that she hadn't read the committee's 108 pages of evidence. Undeterred, Dorries returned to Twitter 2 weeks later. We also need to keep a close eye on the careers of the Conservative MPs who sat on that committee. Did they suddenly find themselves on chicken runs into safe seats? Gongs? Were promises made? We need to know if they were. Justice has to be seen to be done at all levels of this process. Of course, Mad Nad had no evidence whatsoever of her assertions. This is just wild speculation with no basis in reality. And here she is again during an appearance on the weird new right-wing channel Talk TV. I don't think there was ever a world in which this committee was going to find Boris innocent. The committee have demonstrated very clearly that they have decided early on to find him guilty. The committee knew that they had not a shred of evidence to prove that he misled with intent. They changed the rules, lowered the bar, and inserted the vague term reckless into the terms of reference. Boris Johnson will be found guilty by this kangaroo court. There is no doubt about that, and that in itself would be a disgrace and possibly unlawful conclusion with serious reputational consequences. Again, just a mad nad rant with no basis in fact or reality. Far from a shred of evidence, the committee produced 108 pages of carefully documented proof of Johnson's multiple lies to the House of Commons. Dorries then spouted her nonsense in the Daily Mail. This expert legal opinion shows that the inquiry was a biased, Kafkaesque witch hunt. It should now be halted before it does any more damage. This bonkers pronouncement by Dorries related to a desperate intervention by Lord Panic, a Brexitist purist, that was meant to set a devastating blow to the committee's work, but in reality was just a partisan effort to protect Boris Johnson that came to nothing, as it had no legal basis in fact. Now let's turn to Zac Goldsmith, a Tory-appointed lord, who, despite his sterling work on the environment, and who seemed once to be a decent bloke, at some point has crossed over to the dark side, probably during his failed London mayoral campaign, when he used racist tropes proffered by his advisers, and who has now joined the band of Johnson-loving, parliamentary democracy-hating talking heads. In retweeting a tweet calling the inquiry a witch hunt and a kangaroo court, he commented, "Exactly this. There was only ever going to be one outcome, and the evidence was totally irrelevant to it." Well, at least he admitted that there was evidence, more than Dorries ever has. And then there's this from Mark Jenkinson, now a Tory MP but formerly of UKIP. Not that there's much difference between the two these days. When the witch hunt has been forgotten, future generations will look back in astonishment. The phrase witch hunt, shamelessly and obviously being borrowed from the Trump lexicon, of course. Also furious on Twitter was keyboard warrior and wig model Michael Fabricant, who tweeted, "Serious questions will need to be asked about the manner in which the investigation was conducted. These were no jurists, as was apparent by the tone of the examination. The question of calibre, malice and prejudice will need to be answered now or by historians." Well, how about answering now, Michael? How are you going to answer the question given that you have no evidence whatsoever to back up your assertions? But possibly even more bonkers was this from environment-hating, coal mine-loving Brendan Clark-Smith on Twitter. "Tonight, we saw the end result of a parliamentary witch hunt which would put a banana republic to shame. It is the people of this country who elect and decide on their MPs. It's called democracy, and we used to value it here. Sadly, this no longer appears to be the case." I would have thought that a cross-party privilege committee of MPs who reached a unanimous conclusion after months of rigorously sifting through evidence is precisely what our parliamentary democracy is meant to be about. Again, attacking the credibility of the committee rather than their findings, playing the man, not the ball. And that same phrase, kangaroo court, was trotted out by the haunted Victorian pencil Jacob Rees-Mogg on BBC Radio 4. Asked whether he shared the view expressed by some of Mr Johnson's supporters that the process was a kangaroo court, he said, "I think it makes kangaroo courts look respectable." Here's the dictionary definition of a kangaroo court. An unofficial court, the inquiry was about as official as it gets, held by a group of people in order to try someone regarded, especially without good evidence, as guilty of a crime or misdemeanour. Again, 108 pages of undisputed evidence, unanimously accepted across a cross-party committee of MPs. It's as far from a kangaroo court as you could get. I mean, it didn't even get to carry out its own verdict. That's up to the full House of Commons to decide. It's just a ludicrous claim. Rees-Mogg told his 50-odd viewers on his bonkers TV show on the partisan GB News channel, "The Privileges Committee is not even a proper legal setup. It has a gossamer of constitutional propriety thrown over it, but it is in fact a political committee against Boris Johnson." Just nonsense. Common select committees, such as the Committee of Privileges, are an essential and constitutional part of our parliamentary democracy. Again, Moggy feels he has to attack the validity of the committee because he can't find any flaws in the evidence they've produced. Andrea Jenkins on Twitter: "I hope to see him fully exonerated and to put an end to this kangaroo court." Yawn. This Trumpian phrase kangaroo court has actually been lifted from a central briefing sent to all remaining members of the dwindling Boris Johnson fan club, and they've been asked to parrot it at every opportunity. Finally, disgraced ex-minister Priti Patel weighs in through the medium of right-wing rule-breaking channel GB News, saying, "How can a handful of members of parliament in a committee, really be that objective in light of some of the individual comments that have been made? I don't want to name people, but it is a fact, the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability. I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly, involved here." So Patel thinks there's been a culture of collusion. Nothing to say about the 108 pages of evidence. She can find no flaw in that. So instead she throws around some phrases like lack of transparency, lack of accountability, that are the opposite of the truth, just to throw mud and hope that some of it sticks. The most ironic aspect of this whole coordinated and pathetic attempt to undermine parliamentary sovereignty is that Brexit was meant to be all about parliamentary sovereignty, taking back control from the European Parliament in Brussels. The behaviour of the Boris Johnson fan club, die-hard Brexitists each and every one, just illustrates that sovereignty means absolutely sod all to them. It was just another fake reason given to bolster a Brexit campaign based on fake reasons and lies. In this video, I've outlined just the most egregious attacks on the committee, but as a parting thought, these were just a part of a wider campaign to take down the committee. The money for peerage Tory donor Peter Cruddas and another Tory-appointed lord, Stephen Greenhalgh, were found to have been among more than 600 people who directly emailed Tory members of the committee using a template devised by the Conservative Post website. An article on the website inviting people to lobby the committee said that all 4 Tories should step down immediately to send a strong message that we will not tolerate politically motivated attacks against our party. We can only wait and see what, if any, sanctions the 2 houses of Parliament impose on these conspiracists. Given the Tory majorities in both houses and an exceptionally weak Prime Minister in Rishi Sunak, I won't be holding my breath.